Hi everyone, thanks for joining me here on JKD Handmade. For this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to work up a raglan style sweater or top. The stitches that I used are single crochet. I used double crochet for most of the sweater or top, and then I worked up these flower puffs using puff stitches. For the tutorial itself, I will be working up this top. However, I will cut into the video every now and then to explain how I went about working the sweater. I will be working a size medium for this tutorial. I will provide all measurements for sizes from child to adult 5XL to follow along. For the materials, you will need yarn. I used cotton yarns for my top. The recommended hook on this yarn is a 3 to 3.5 millimeter hook. I went about using 2 hooks for my pattern. So it's the recommended hook for my ribbings. And on this cotton top, I went up 1 size larger than the recommended hook, which is a 4 millimeter hook for the rest of the top. For the sweater, I used this budget-friendly double knit, which is a category 3 or light worsted. I used this as my base color, and then for these flower puffs, I used the same weight in a multi-tone. The recommended hook on this yarn is a 4 millimeter hook. I used that recommended hook for my ribbings, and for the rest of the sweater, I went up 2 sizes using a 6 millimeter hook. I used around 300 grams for the top, and I used 500 grams for my sweater. When it comes to your yarn selection, do take into consideration these flower puffs. You will have to gather up many loops onto your hook. So I tried it out, and I think that the yarn that I used was quite thick. So when I gathered up my loops onto this hook, I found it really difficult. That way I went for a thinner yarn. You do get category 4s that are slightly thinner. So yeah, the choice of yarn is up to you, but take into consideration that you have to gather up all those loops onto your hook. You'll see in the tutorial itself on how I go about working these flower puffs. You will also need a pair of scissors, measuring tape, stitch markers, and a yarn or a wool needle. To those of you who are new to my channel, please do consider subscribing. And to those of you who have already, a huge thank you. Let's get on with this tutorial, and I hope you enjoy. We'll begin with a slip knot. Using the smaller of the 2 hooks, you'll use your smaller hook for all the ribbings. Chain 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Round 1 into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. So that's 1 and 2. Into that chain, insert your hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, and go through 2 loops on the hook. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. I have 4 stitches. At all times, make certain that your stitch count remains the same for the rest of the ribbing. Round 2, chain 1 and turn. Here we're working our stitches into the back loops. If you look at your stitches, they're made up of 2 loops. The one closest to you is the front loop, and the one away from you is the back loop. We will work all our stitches into the back loops. Your first stitch is the one from where chain 1 comes out of. Work single crochets into the back loops only. have 4 stitches. Round 3, chain 1 and turn. So for the rest of the ribbing, we're repeating round 2. That's single crochets into the back loops only. Continue on to work a length for your ribbing. I've continued on with my ribbing and I have a length for this ribbing. All I've done was repeat round 2. At this point, you need to check that this length of ribbing fits around the head of the person that you are making this for. So that is physically fitting this ribbing around the person's head, and these two ends should meet. The ribbing must fit unstretched. Once you have your ribbing fitted and it fits, you can go ahead and count the number of rounds of ribbing that you've worked. So if you look at the ribbing, here you have these raised bits on your ribbing. In between those, there are 2 rounds. So in between all these raised areas, there are 2 rounds of ribbing. So if I count my ribbing, here's 1 and 2. Then in between these 2, there's 1 and 2. So I'll count it as 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, and so on. The number of rounds of ribbing must fit into this chart. It's a ribbing and stitch count chart. So for this chart, on the one side, I have the ribbing rounds, and these 3 digits here, these are the separations of your yoke. So we firstly working our ribbing to these ribbing rounds right here. Now, these are not in any way connected to sizes. This is the starting point, and it starts with that head measurement for your ribbing. Remember to always fit on the ribbing unstretched. That's really important. The more you stretch it, the more you risk tightening up on your raglan. So here I have the ribbing rounds. Those are all the ribbing rounds, and these are the separations. So this is the chart. And as I said, they are not connected to any sizes. You'll find that with different yarns, you always get different ribbing rounds. It all depends on the yarn that you are using. Every time you work a raglan, you need to recheck your ribbing rounds. Now I've counted mine, and mine worked out to 84. So in order to fit this chart, I needed to go to the closest here, and it's 88. I would rather go further on the chart than going less on that chart. So I chose to work it to 88 rounds. So I worked on a further 4 rounds and brought it to 88 rounds. Now from there, I decided that I want this top to fit loose around my neckline. This ribbing sits at the neckline. So to do that, I actually worked a few more rounds and brought up my ribbing rounds to 104 rounds. So here I worked more rounds and increased on that neckline ribbing here. So you can do that. This will make the ribbing sit further away from the neck. When you work to the exact head circumference, you have a good fit on your raglan. Then when you increase the neckline ribbing, and you increase on your foot as you work down the raglan. So I worked on a few more rounds and I brought it to 104 rounds. So when it came to my sweater, I've still got ends to weave in here, but when it came to the ribbing on my sweater, I worked it to the exact ribbing round here. this ribbing fitted my head circumference. So it all depends on the fit that you're going for. I just found for my sweater I wanted a good fit here. There are other ways to adjust the fit on your clothing. It's like you can adjust it under the arm with the chain that's worked under the arm. You can also adjust it with your armhole depth, but as we get into the tutorial I'll explain more there. Okay, so moving on here, we'll now join these two ends on our ribbing. It's chain 1, and then you bring those two ends together, making certain that your ribbing is not twisted. And here we slip stitching, so I'll just work into those back loops once again, get into the back loop on the stitch from one side, and then it's into the stitch on the opposite side. And then you pull the first loop through the second loop. So you'll do that again. With 4 stitches on your ribbing, you need to slip stitch 4 times. So here's my third, and then it's my 4th. That joins the ribbing. Now I'll swap out my hook for the larger hook. We're working round 1 of the raglan. Here we're working single crochets along this edge of the ribbing. You'll see that there are no stitches to work into. We'll work into these little gaps along this top edge. So as I said, in between these ridges there are 2 rounds of ribbing. So for every round of ribbing we'll work 1 single crochet. Then it's chain 1, single crochet into that first gap, single crochet into the next gap, and then you'll continue on with single crochets along this edge of the ribbing. The number of single crochets you work must be the same as the number of rounds of ribbing. In my case, I worked 104 rounds of ribbing, so I need to work 104 single crochets. And then it's 2 single crochets in between these ridges. So you'll continue on to the end of the round. I've continued on with those single crochets. Before joining, make certain that the number of single crochets you've worked is the same as your ribbing rounds. According to the chart, I worked 104 ribbing rounds, so I must have 104 single crochets. I've counted my stitches and I can move on. So to end the round, into your first stitch, slip stitch to join. We will now separate this ribbing into 4 parts. That's going to be your sleeve, front body, sleeve, and the back body. So here you need your stitch markers. You're working according to your chart. So for me, that first stitch is the 23rd stitch. From start will be my first stitch. So that's 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 22, and 23. Then it's my 53rd. So that's 24, 6, 8, 30, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 50, and 53. And then it's my 75th. So that's 54, 6, 8, 60, 2, 4, 6, 8, 70, 2, 4, 75. So you've got 3 stitch markers in place. These stitch markers mark off corners. So right at start is our first corner, then moving down second corner, third corner, and your fourth corner. And if you look at it from start to that stitch marker is your sleeve 1, and then you have your front body, sleeve 2, and your back body. Round 2, it's chain 2, 1, 2, and turn. You will turn after every round. Here we're working double crochets into all stitches. At our corners we will work a V-stitch. So into that next stitch you can double crochet, continue on with double crochets to the first stitch marker. I've worked my way to the first stitch marker, so I'll remove that stitch marker. Into the stitch marker I'll work a V-stitch, so it's just a double crochet, chain 1, double crochet, all worked into that one stitch. So here we have a V-stitch. Always replace your stitch markers into those chain 1 spaces. We'll work our V-stitches into these chain 1 spaces, and this is what helps grow the yoke. Then you continue on working double crochets in between the stitch markers, and you work V-stitches into those stitches marked by those stitch markers. I've continued on, here I am, so I've worked those double crochets all around. I've worked V-stitches into all these stitches marked off as my corners. So that's 1, 2, and 3, and here I am. I need to work the last corner. Into the stitch from where that chain 2 comes out of, work a double crochet right at the bottom of that stitch. And then it's a chain 1, slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2. Round 2, chain 1 and turn. Slip stitch into that chain 1 space to get into that space. Then it's chain 2. Chain 2 counts as a double crochet. So for this round, we're working our flower puffs. Now I chose to be very random with these. I didn't want any sort of pattern here. What I actually did was for round 2, I skipped the sleeve section and I worked my flower puff, one on the front body and one on the back body, just so that I keep this random. So I will work double crochets all along the sleeve. When I get to my front body, I'll work the flower puff, and when I get to the sleeve on the opposite side, I'll work double crochets, and for the back body I'll work 1 flower puff. That's just to keep it random. So it's 1 here, 1 there, and then I'll work around or so, and then I'll work a flower puff on the sleeves, and so I'll alternate here and there. It all depends on, as I'm working, I'll continuously look at my piece just to see where I can fit in a flower puff. There's only one rule to the stitch pattern. You cannot work the stitch pattern too close to your corners. You've got to leave like 2 stitches before or after every corner. So for this flower puff stitch pattern, you need 6 stitches. If I choose to work it here, I must make certain that I have at least 8 stitches remaining in order to work that flower puff. That's the only rule with the stitch pattern. I'll work double crochets to my first corner. Remember here you're working double crochets into all double crochets, and that applies to these double crochets that make up the V-stitch as well. So into that double crochet, I'll work a stitch, and then I'll continue on with double crochets to that first corner. Here I am at the first corner. I've worked a double crochet into that stitch that makes up this V-stitch. I'll remove my stitch marker and I'll work a corner into this corner. So that's a V-stitch into that chain 1 space. Replace your stitch marker into the chain 1 space. And then you continue with double crochets into all double crochets. Notice that I'm working my stitches into those double crochets that make up the V-stitch. Okay, so like I said, I'm now at the front. So always, here's my start. This will always be the sleeve on the one side, and on the opposite side is my sleeve 2. And then I've got my front body and my back body. Make certain that you always know where your sleeve is. If you are unsure, place a stitch marker on either side here so that you know that this is your sleeve section. It's rather close when it comes to the number of stitches, but as the yoke grows, you will be able to see that your front and back body is slightly longer or wider than your sleeves. You'll see that as we turn to our next round, we're working this way. So we're working our back body. So yeah, just a tip, place those stitch markers if you are unsure. Okay, so here I am at the front body. Now I want to work a flower puff. So I'll work 2 stitches, or as I said, a minimum of 2 stitches. I think I'm going to go for maybe 4 here. And then work my flower puff. So let's work that flower puff. We'll be using 6 stitches for the flower puff. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And here we're working puff stitches. We'll work unfinished puffs into the first stitch. We'll skip the next stitch. We'll work an unfinished puff, skip the next stitch, work an unfinished puff, and then we'll complete our stitch into this last stitch here. So those are those 6 stitches. Okay, so to work these unfinished puffs, it's yarn over, insert your hook into that first stitch, pull up a loop, and elongate the loop. Then yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop, and elongate the loop. Yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop, and elongate the loop. And one more time, yarn over, insert your hook into that stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop. Without finishing up on the stitch, you need to skip the next stitch and work an unfinished puff into that next stitch. So it's yarn over, insert your hook into that stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop, yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop, yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop, yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop. You work this 4 times for every unfinished puff. Then you'll skip the next stitch and you'll work an unfinished puff into the next stitch. So it's yarn over, insert your hook into that next stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop. That was 1 time, and then here's the 2nd time, 3rd time, and the 4th time. So you have all these loops on your hook. Now to finish off on this puff, you'll insert your hook into the next stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over and go through that loop on your hook, yarn over and go through that next loop on your hook. So you've worked 2 chains here. Then you'll take those and you'll pull it through all those puffs, those unfinished puffs, and then it's a chain 1 to secure. So this is what you have. Then you can slip stitch into that chain 1. And now we're working another puff stitch above these 3 unfinished puffs. So elongate that loop slightly, yarn over, insert your hook into that chain 1, pull up a loop, elongate the loop. That was 1 time. Here's 2, 3, and 4. And then it's yarn over and go through all those loops on the hook, and it's a chain 1 to secure. Then into that stitch where we had worked those 2 chains, we will work a double crochet. Now we've completed half or slightly more than half of this flower puff. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 petals. In our next round, we'll work 2 more petals to complete the stitch pattern. So to complete this flower stitch pattern, you need to work it in 2 rounds. Continue on with double crochets into all your stitches. When you get to your corners, you work a V-stitch. I've worked my way. Here's that first flower puff. I've worked double crochets, a V-stitch into that chain 1 space, double crochets, a V-stitch into my next corner, and then here I am, and I wish to work a flower puff right here. I'll work into the next 6 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So here I go with my unfinished puff stitches. I've done that 4 times. Skip the next stitch and unfinished puff into the next stitch. Skip the next stitch and unfinished puff into the next stitch. And then here we'll finish off on this puff. So I'll insert my hook into that 6th stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over and go through that loop, yarn over and go through that loop. I formed 2 chains. I'll pull that through all these puffs, and then it's a chain 1 to secure, and I'll slip stitch into that same chain 1 space, elongate the loop, and I'll work a puff stitch above these 3 unfinished puffs. Chain 1 to secure, and then it's a double crochet into that same stitch from where those 2 chains came out of. So here I have my 1, 2, 3, and 4 petals. Continue on with double crochets to the end of the round. I've worked my way to the end of round 3. Here I am. So to end the round, we need to form a corner right here. Into that chain 1 that I had started off with, work a double crochet. Then it's chain 1 and slip stitch into the 2nd chain from chain 2 to join. round 4, chain 1 and turn. Slip stitch into that chain space. For every round you will always slip stitch into the chain spaces to keep your corners. Then it's chain 2. Chain 2 counts as a double crochet. Continue on with double crochets into all stitches and corners at those allocated chain 1 spaces. And then we'll complete the flower stitch pattern once we get to those stitch patterns. So right here and right there. I've worked my way to the flower puff stitch pattern. I've worked my last double crochet into the stitch from the previous round. So then it's chain 1. And here we're working our stitches into the center of that flower puff. So that's where we had chained 1 above those unfinished puff stitches in the previous round. So we'll work a puff stitch into that space. Then it's a chain 1 to secure that stitch. We'll work 1 more petal to complete the stitch. So that's 1 more puff stitch. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then it's a chain 1 to secure that stitch. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 petals. And then if you look at your stitch, so here's that chain 2 from the round before that's being pulled into the puff stitch. That is where we will work a double crochet. And then we'll continue on with double crochets into our stitches, the double crochets from the round before. Above the puff stitch, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches right there. I've worked my way to the second flower puff. At all times, I work corners or V stitches into those chain 1s. So make certain that your corners are always in place, working those V stitches into those chain 1 spaces. So here I am at my second flower puff. It's a chain 1, puff stitch into that chain space. Another puff stitch into that chain space. Then you will double crochet into that chain 2 that is being pulled into this unfinished puff at the bottom. Continue on with double crochets into your stitches from the round before. I continued on and I completed round 4 by double crocheting into that chain 1 from the round before, and then it was a chain 1 and slip stitch into my second chain from chain 2. You will end every round in this way for your yoke. Then I chained 1, turned, slip stitched into my chain 1 space, and it was a chain 2. I worked double crochets for this next round, and then I thought I'll work a flower puff pattern at the sleeve here, and I'll work one on the opposite side. Now this is really an open-ended pattern. You have the freedom to work as many of these flower puff stitch patterns as you'd like, as many or as few as you'd like. And then I chose to keep my flower puffs random throughout this top. There is no specific pattern. I didn't worry about counting my stitches. Wherever I felt that there was a good enough space to work a flower puff, I went ahead and worked one. So here I am in my next round. I'm working one on either side of my sleeve, and then to continue on in my next round, round 5, when I get to my flower puff, I need to work double crochets along this top edge. At the top of the stitch pattern, you'll see there are stitches, so that's 1, 2, 3, and 4 stitches. Work 4 double crochets into those stitches, 1 double crochet per stitch. And then you'll continue on with double crochets into those double crochets from the round before. So I also chose to sort of tier my flower puffs. I would work one here and then skip a few rounds before working the next one, so that one is high up and the other is slightly lower, and so on. It's just to keep it random. If you'd like yours uniform, by all means go ahead, that would work as well, just as long as you keep that one rule in mind where you've got to work a few stitches before and after every corner. If you would like to change on your yarn colors, like I'm doing here on the sweater, I'm keeping the yarn weights the same. This is a DK weight, and so is the one for the sweater itself. So I'll just show you these 2 rounds when I change my yarn colors. I've worked double crochets, and here I am, and I think that this is where I've got a space here, right here, and I'd like to work a flower puff right here. So I've got one there, and here's my next one, and here's a next one. So if we look at it here, I can fit in one right there, just to make it look random. So, and I do have more than 6 stitches remaining before I complete the round. So right here, I'll work my double crochet, leaving the 2 loops on my hook, so it's an unfinished double crochet, and then I can cut off on excess yarn, leaving behind a tail, long enough tail end to help with the seaming. I'll bring in my next yarn color. I went with a multi-tone, and then I'll fold in a little loop there. Bring that loop through those 2 loops on your hook, leaving behind a tail end on this as well. Always keep your tail ends on the wrong side. And then I'll continue on with my stitch pattern. So here I'm working those 3 unfinished puff stitches, and then obviously I'm skipping stitches in between. So here's my first, that was 1, skip the next stitch. Here's my second, skip the next stitch, and here's my third. And then it's my chain 2 into that next stitch, and I can complete this puff stitch. then it's my chain 1. At this point, I want to go back to the wrong side, and I do always want to knot on these ends just to keep them in place. Continuing on, it's a slip stitch into that chain 1, and it's a puff stitch into that chain 1. Chain 1 to secure, and now I can cut off on that yarn and bring in my base color. Make a little loop, bring that through, continuing on with this base color, double crochet into your last stitch right there, and then you continue on with this base color. Always go back and knot on those tail ends just to keep your stitches in place. So this is round 1 of, or the first round that makes up this flower puff. I'll get back to you when I'm working my second round. Here I am working the second round that makes up this flower puff. I'm working it on the wrong side of my flower puff. So when you get to this round, that last double crochet, always make certain to work your last stitch into that stitch before continuing on with the flower puff. Now you may find it slightly difficult to get into that stitch because that's where we had joined from our last round, but you still need to work a stitch into that stitch. Continue on with your double crochet, leaving 2 loops on your hook. Cut off on the excess. Bring in your next color. Here it is, forming a little loop to pull through and complete your stitch. Keep your tail ends on the wrong side. Then it's a chain 1, and here into that chain 1 space, right in between these petals, you'll work 2 puff stitches. Here's my second. Go back and tighten up on these yarn ends by knotting them. So I've got my 6 petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Cut off on the excess here and go back to your base color, forming a little loop, pull it through. Keep your tail ends on the wrong side and continue on with the double crochets into your stitches. Go back and knot on those tail ends. So that's the flower puff that we've just worked. Okay, so you continue on with the stitch pattern to complete your yoke. I'll get back to you once I'm done with that. I've continued on with the yoke. I've repeated those rounds as I did, working my 4 corners. So here's the corner at start, and then my second, third, and 4th. I also repeated these flower puff stitch patterns. You can see that I've spaced them randomly. Sometimes I even went and worked a few rounds of double crochet in between my stitch pattern, just to give it that random here and there spaced look. So here's the sleeve, the front body, the sleeve, and the back body. Now we need to move on to the body of this raglan. So here along the sleeves, we'll fold our yoke in half. And we need to measure the armhole depth for the size that we are working. With your measuring tape, you measure along this edge your armhole depth. Now the armhole depth for a size medium is 7 inches or 7.5 inches. So that's around 19 centimeters. You'll see that I went slightly longer on my armhole depth. I took it to 8 inches or 20 centimeters. You can work your yoke to slightly more than your armhole depth, but you cannot work it shorter than your armhole depth. If you work it shorter, you're going to have something that doesn't really fit the size that you are working on. And if you make it longer, you are in fact increasing the size of both the body and the sleeves. So you're making this much bigger. And that's what I'm going for. I want a looser fit on my top. So work your yoke to what you are looking for your top to be in terms of fit, whether you're looking for a looser fit or something that is more fitted. Continuing on from where we've stopped at this start. So this is our first corner. We'll chain 1 and turn. We're now working the body, and this is round 1. Into that first corner, that V-stitch, slip stitch, and then you'll chain 2. Chain 2 counts as our first double crochet. So here you'll chain 3. Now this chain 3 also affects the fit of the raglan. It increases on both the body and the sleeves of this raglan. You can chain any amount of chains, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it may be. It will work with the stitch pattern, or you may even go ahead and not chain at all. So that initial chain 2 counted as my chain 2, and then it's a chain 3, and I'll skip the stitches in between. So you'll skip the stitches in between. These are the stitches that make up the sleeve portion, and into that stitch marker, the next corner, that chain 1, work a double crochet. So you're joining here, you're joining your front body and your back body, and you formed an armhole space. Continue with your stitch pattern to the next stitch marker. So here I'm working double crochets, and wherever I've got my second round of my flower puffs to work, I will do that. And if I feel that I need to work more of these flower puffs anywhere, I will go ahead and work that first round, and you'll continue on to that next stitch marker right here. I've worked my way to my next stitch marker. See that I'm continuing on with my flower puff stitch pattern as I go on, and it's just wherever I feel I need to work a stitch pattern. And then I continued on. Here's my next stitch marker. I'll work a double crochet into that chain 1 space, and then it's a chain 3. So this chain must be the same as your first chain, and then you'll skip the stitches in between that sleeve and join to your last stitch marker with a double crochet into that chain space. So here you have your second armhole space, and there's your chain 3. Continue on with double crochets into all your stitches to the end of the round. I've worked my way to the end of round 1 to complete the round into the second chain from that initial chain 2, slip stitch to join. Before continuing on, I find myself always wanting to get into the center of this chain 3, so that when I'm working my body, my seam runs directly down the center of the side of this top. So I'm going to slip stitch twice to get into the second chain. That's 1 and 2. And then it's chain 2. Chain 2 counts as my first stitch, turn, and I'll continue on with working double crochets into my chains and double crochets into my stitches, and I'll work the flower puff stitch pattern wherever I feel I need to. Continue on with your stitch pattern. When you get to the end of the round, you can slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2 to join. Remember to work double crochets into this chain on the opposite side as well. I've continued on with this top. Now you'll see that at the top for the yoke, I had spaced out my flower puffs, as you see here. And then as I worked down, I worked the body. And here I just repeated the round 2 until I got to the length for this top. But as I worked my way down, I began bringing those flower puffs quite close together. You will see right at the bottom here. So they are closely spaced here. And I thought I'd like to leave my edging this way with these flower puffs closely worked. It is still worked randomly. I didn't count my stitches in between and such. I just worked those puffs wherever I felt I needed to work them. So I ended up the top like this. Once I got to my length, I fastened off and cut off on the excess. For my sweater, I worked ribbings. I worked ribbings at the bottom of the sweater and for the sleeves here. So you'll see that for my sweater, I kept the spacing more or less the same. Again, I didn't count my stitches in between. I just worked them randomly, these flower puffs randomly. To work these ribbings for the sweater, I continued on from where I had stopped. I just worked a chain. I'll show you how to do this when I get to the sleeve on my top. I worked a chain. On the sweater, I chained 7, and then I worked with that chain 7 to complete the ribbings on both the bottom and the sleeves. Okay, so let's get on with this pattern. For the sleeves, I kept my sleeve short here. I worked one round of double crochet and then I worked the ribbing. Again, for my sweater, I went longer on the sleeves, so I continued on. I attached yarn at the underarm and I continued on working in the round as I had done for the body, and I worked my flower puffs here and there until I got to the length that I wanted my sleeve at. Okay, so I've already worked one sleeve on my top. I will show you how to work the sleeve on the other armhole space. Attach yarn to the underarm. Chain 2. Chain 2 counts as my first stitch. And here you're working double crochets into all stitches. You may find at the bottom, or rather at the underarm itself, there are no stitches to work into. You'll work them closely or evenly spaced into these little gaps. Continue on with double crochets all the way around the armhole space. I've worked my way to the end of the first round for the sleeve. So to complete the round, it's into that second chain from chain 2, slip stitch to join. Now, if you're wanting to work longer sleeves, you'll continue on. You'll work those flower puffs and as you had done for the body of your top. But in my case, I choose to keep these sleeves on my top short. So I'll work an edging here. Now the edging is exactly the same as I had done for my sweater. It's just that for the sweater, I had chained more chains for a wider ribbing. Swap out your hook for the smaller hook. And then it's chain 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Into the second chain from the hook. Single crochet. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. You have 4 stitches. We need to now attach this end of the ribbing to our bottom edge right here. To do that, we'll work 2 slip stitches. So that's 1 and 2. Now for my sweater, especially the sleeve on that sweater, you'll see that the sweater tapers slightly. You'll see that it comes out wide here, and then as I get to the ribbing here, it tapers slightly. And that's because I worked 3 slip stitches instead of 2. So 3 slip stitches will tighten up even more on that ribbing. Here you can go with 2 slip stitches for a straight up fit on your ribbing, or you can even alternate between 2 slip stitches and 3 slip stitches. Like I said, I worked 3 slip stitches to give me that tapered ribbing. Continuing on here, I've slip stitched twice and then it's turn. So we're working round 2. Always skip those slip stitches. I've worked 2 slip stitches, so I'll skip the first 2 stitches right there. Those are my slip stitches. Into the next stitch, single crochet, working all your stitches into the back loops only. Then for the next round, it's chain 1, turn, single crochet into the back loops only. Your first stitch is the one that chain 1 comes out of. And then to join your ribbing onto this edge, slip stitch twice, turn, skip those slip stitches, and then it's single crochet into the back loops only. So you'll continue on with your ribbing all around this armhole space. I've worked my way to the end of the ribbing on my sleeve. I've used up all the stitches at the bottom. So when you get to the end and you find that you have only one stitch remaining, you can just slip stitch once and then work your way up. Your ribbing needs to meet the start of the ribbing on the opposite side, and then you know you're done. Now we need to join this end of the ribbing to the bottom edge there and slip stitch upwards. If you ended up on that side of your ribbing, you'll slip stitch to get to this edge right here. Okay, so I'll get to my stitches on the opposite side and I will slip stitch to join. You can then fasten off and cut off on the excess yarn. Now all that's left to do is to weave in all these ends. Using your yarn needle, you'll work those ends into the back of your top. So I must give a few pros and cons on this pattern. I found that working the top in a cotton really gave me that flowy feel that I was looking for, and especially that I had to adjust the pattern, like going bigger on my ribbing and then increasing slightly on my armhole depth. And also when it comes to that chain that's under the arm, that's another way to increase on your foot, on the foot. Remember, when you work that chain, it increases both on your sleeve and on the body with regard to the fit. Now for my sweater, as I told you, I worked the pattern as it is for the size that I'm making. I kept my armhole depth the same and I worked a chain 3 under the armhole space. The only con here was that those ends, I weaved in a lot of ends. It really took up a lot of time. So I have shown you both ways of how to change your yarn and how to just keep on going with the same yarn color. So that's just really up to you. But that's it for this tutorial. If you've enjoyed this video, please do consider subscribing. That way you never get to miss out on any of my tutorials. Remember that if you don't subscribe, my video pops up on your feed and then it just disappears, eventually disappears. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and thank you for watching.